As you've seen in my other videos and future videos to come, I like alternate reality takes of familiar characters. They're accessible to all readers, from the hardcores to those who know the basics, or some who just don't know anything about a particular franchise. This title is one of those, taking our favorite residents of Riverdale back to their roots, but grounding them in something more akin to our reality. Today, we look at why you should be reading Archie 1941. Archie comics have always been an idealized world, often an anachronism in many ways of the current era. Sure, they may use iPhones now, but everything else is more or less unchanged, and real-life events rarely intercede into the comic. This series flips that upside down, giving us what is essentially an alternate timeline of Archie, where the events of that time period are directly affecting the story. Archie Andrews made his first appearance in 1941, so it's no coincidence that this book shares that year in its name. When Archie first appeared in a comic, it was a few years into World War II. In fact, it was the same year that Germany blitzed major British cities, began to invade Russia, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, marking the moment that the United States officially entered the war. And that's where this comic picks up. A 5-issue miniseries written by Brian Augustine and Mark Waid, with art by Peter Krause and colors by Kelly Fitzpatrick, Archie 1941 begins as those familiar faces from the Archie comics, drawn much more realistically than the typical series we know and love, are preparing to graduate high school. Something that they have been locked in a perpetual limbo with in the main comics since forever. With the rest of their lives ahead of them, most are uncertain about their immediate future, but then FDR and Churchill sign the Atlantic Charter, and the US is thrown into war. So what are Archie and his chums up to in this comic? Living the best life they can during some very hard times. Now, mild plot spoilers ahead as I discuss a little of what the characters have been up to so far. After graduation, Archie is confused about what to do next in life, and has a very stern father who disapproves of his lack of future plans. Archie is searching for approval from his father, and with no idea what to do with himself, he volunteers to enlist and join the war on the front lines. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Jughead's family refuses to allow him to enlist after graduating, which makes him feel guilty to know his best friend is fighting the war while he's busy sipping milkshakes. Meanwhile, Veronica is completely oblivious to the war, and at this point more or less unaffected by it due to her affluence. While others have to ration and pay more for gas as the prices elevate from shortages, Veronica barely bats an eyelash to it. Meanwhile, Betty has to deal with the fact that her love, Archie, is going off to war. A lot of time is devoted to the families of our teens, including soda shop owner Pop Tate, who is basically the local father figure to everyone in Riverdale. With the world around him changing, and Pop's feeling somewhat left behind, the war affects him even more, and you'll have to read the comic to see what happens to his storyline. The guilt of sending away their sons to fight overseas, constant worry about what will happen to their boys, and coping with the changing landscape of everyday life during wartime. It's something that I feel has been missing in many other period stories about World War II, and really humanizes everyone even more. Mark Waid is expert at crafting convincing narratives, and if not for the title of this book, you would never know it to even be an Archie comic. The characters feel real, and the drama feels legit too. At the end of the day, this is an Archie book, so it's not like it's going to turn into a scene from Saving Private Ryan anytime soon, but it does address real issues of that time, including a brief look at racism with the subplot between Chuck and Moose that showed up in issue 4. Unfortunately, that story ultimately went nowhere, but it was nice at least that it was thrown in. I really enjoyed the art in this comic, especially with the attention to the backgrounds Peter Krause gives. I really dig the wet brush inkwork look, and the color is just as eye-catching. Every aspect of the series fits together and was clearly thought out. A few great examples are how colorist Kelly Fitzpatrick will use those background colors to reinforce the mood. It's a very simple concept, but it doesn't make it any less effective. It definitely looks, feels, and sounds like the 1940s, or at least what I know of it from watching old movies, and I appreciate the attention to detail and feeling of the entire comic. Despite being called Archie 1941, this comic takes place through most of the US's time in the Second World War. In fact, by issue 4, we're already up to November of 1942, when Archie's unit is deployed to North Africa. Speaking of, I won't say what happens in that issue or the conclusion of the comic overall, but it was quite a roller coaster ride from there. It certainly speaks to the time period it represents, full of innocence lost, realities changed forever, and miracles when you need them most. I never thought I would be this attached to an Archie comic, but here I am making a video recommending it to you guys. I can't say I've read much Archie in my lifetime, but you don't need to enjoy the book. It's a pretty gripping comic that's doing things with the Archie universe you wouldn't really ever expect to see happen. This is not the silly kids comic you may have grown up with. This is a stark look at how the lives of people in a small town were affected by the harsh reality of war. Now with the series completely wrapped up, it's extremely easy to find this in a trade, so I highly recommend hunting this down. Wonderfully illustrated with engaging characters and surprising takes on those familiar faces, this is the anti-Archie you never knew that you wanted. I'm Matthew from Nerd News Today, and that's why you should be reading Archie 1941.